Don't move. Step away from the car right now.
Officer, this is my home. What's going on?
I asked you a question. You fit the description, and people like you always think you can talk your way out.
I haven't done anything
That's
wrong.
what you all say. Turn around before I make you.
You're making a serious mistake.
At 6:14 a.m. on a Saturday morning in Alexandria, Virginia, inside one of the most exclusive gated communities in the D.C. metro area, a black woman stood alone in her driveway loading luggage into the back of a silver Lexus SUV. Her name was Nadine Ashford. She was 54 years old. She had been a United States federal judge for 11 years, appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and assigned to a bench where she had handled hundreds of cases involving constitutional law, civil rights, and federal criminal matters. That morning, she wore no robe and carried no gavel. She was dressed in a casual travel outfit, yoga pants, a zip-up jacket, and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She was heading to Dulles International Airport to catch a 9:15 flight to Chicago for a federal judicial conference where she was scheduled to deliver the keynote address on the future of due process in immigration law. Her carry-on sat on the curb. A garment bag hung from the rear door handle. A travel mug of coffee rested on the roof of the car. Everything about the scene was ordinary, a woman leaving her home on a quiet weekend morning. But what happened in the next 11 minutes would trigger a federal investigation, destroy careers inside one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the country, and send shockwaves from a suburban driveway all the way to the halls of Congress. At 6:17 a.m., 3 unmarked black Chevrolet Suburbans turned onto Ashford Street and rolled to a stop directly in front of her driveway, blocking her vehicle completely. 6 agents in tactical vests exited in formation. The letters ICE were printed across their chests. The lead agent was Craig Delano, 43 years old, a supervisory detention and deportation officer with 16 years in federal law enforcement. He had a reputation inside his field office for running aggressive operations, for pushing boundaries that other supervisors walked carefully around, and for a pattern of complaints from communities of color that had been quietly filed and never acted upon. He approached Ashford with his hand resting on his sidearm, his posture wide, his jaw set. "You, stop what you're doing. Step away from the vehicle." Ashford turned slowly, both hands visible, one still holding a folded jacket. She looked at the agents, then at Delano. "Can I help you?" Delano didn't answer the question. "You match the description of a person of interest in an active immigration enforcement operation. I need to see identification. Now." Ashford set the jacket on the bumper. Her voice was calm, measured, the tone of someone who had spent over a decade controlling courtrooms. "I'm Judge Nadine Ashford. I'm a federal judge with the United States District Court. This is my home." Delano's eyes narrowed. He glanced at the SUV, then back at her. "Sure you are." He turned his head slightly toward the agent behind him. "She's being evasive. Watch her hands." Ashford didn't flinch. "Do you have a warrant?" "I don't need a warrant. Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle." Her voice stayed level but firm. "Yes, you do. You are on private property. You have not identified a crime. You have not presented a warrant. As a matter of law, you do not have authority to detain me." Delano stepped closer, close enough that his vest nearly touched her shoulder. "I don't answer to you. Turn around. Now." Ashford held his gaze. "I'm asking you one more time. Do you have a warrant?" Delano said nothing. His hand moved from his sidearm to her arm. Across the street, a porch light clicked on. A curtain moved in a second-floor window. An older man in a bathrobe stepped outside and stood motionless on his front lawn, phone already raised. Neighbors were watching, and someone had already pressed record. Agent Tara Schofield, 31, second in command on the team, and 7 years into a career she had built by never questioning the lead agent on any operation, moved silently behind Ashford. She positioned herself at the judge's left shoulder, cutting off any path of retreat, her hands already reaching forward. Delano grabbed Ashford's right arm and spun her body toward the SUV. The motion was fast and violent. Ashford's shoulder struck the side mirror with a dull crack that echoed across the quiet street. Her coffee mug slid off the roof and shattered on the driveway. She didn't scream. She didn't swing. She planted her feet and said clearly, loud enough for every agent and every neighbor now stepping outside to hear, "I am a federal judge. You are making a serious mistake." Delano's voice came back hard. "Stop resisting." She was not resisting. Her hands were open. Her body was still. Schofield grabbed her left arm and wrenched it behind her back. Together they forced her forward, pressing her chest against the hood of her own vehicle, the metal still cold from the morning air. Delano snapped the cuffs on, ratcheting them tighter than necessary. Ashford's cheek pressed against the paint. Her glasses fell from her head and landed on the concrete. From across the street, a voice cut through the scene like a blade. "That's Judge Ashford." "What the hell are you doing?" The man crossing the lawn was Colonel Eldon Pratt, 68 years old, retired United States Air Force, 30 years of service, a man who had commanded squadrons overseas, and now lived 3 houses down from a woman he had known for nearly a decade. He moved fast for his age, bathrobe open, slippers on wet grass, finger pointed directly at Delano. Delano turned. "Sir, get back, now, or you will be detained for obstruction of a federal operation." Pratt didn't move. Behind him, through the front window of his home, his wife was already on the phone with 911, her voice shaking as she described what she was watching from her living room. Without a word of explanation, the agents began searching Ashford's vehicle. No consent was given, no warrant was produced, no inventory sheet was started. They opened the rear hatch and pulled out her suitcase, unzipping it on the driveway. They went through her clothes, her toiletry bag, her shoes. They opened her purse and emptied it onto the hood beside her, wallet, keys, lipstick, reading glasses, case, all of it spread out in plain view of the growing crowd. Then they reached the briefcase. It was a leather attaché case with a combination lock, which one of the agents forced open. Inside were sealed federal court documents stamped with case numbers and classification markings, a judicial ID badge from the United States District Court, credentials issued by the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts bearing her photograph, her name, and her title. Delano picked up the judicial ID and held it in front of his face. He stared at it. The photo matched the woman on the hood. The name matched the name she had given. The seal was authentic. Schofield leaned over his shoulder and read the credentials. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but everyone watching felt it. The air shifted. The truth was sitting in Delano's hand, laminated and embossed with the seal of the federal judiciary. But instead of uncuffing her, instead of stepping back and recognizing the magnitude of what he had done, Delano doubled down. He turned to his team. "Finish the sweep. These could be forged." Ashford, still pressed against the hood of her own car in her own driveway, spoke with a voice that carried the weight of 11 years on the federal bench. "You are now searching sealed federal court documents without authorization. You have committed multiple federal crimes." At the back of the formation, the youngest agent on the team, Kyle Rennick, 28, barely a year out of the academy, stood motionless. His face was pale. He leaned towards Schofield and said quietly, "We need to stop." Schofield didn't look at him. Her jaw tightened. "Shut up." By now, 7 neighbors stood on the street and across lawns in various states of Saturday morning dress. Bathrobes, slippers, coffee cups still in hand. 4 of them had phones raised, recording from different angles. The red lights on their screens blinked steadily. Colonel Pratt had not moved from the edge of the driveway. He stood with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking loudly and deliberately to the 911 dispatcher, making sure his voice carried. "I am reporting an unlawful arrest in progress. Federal agents have detained a sitting United States federal judge in her own driveway. No warrant has been presented. She is in handcuffs. I need local police here immediately." A woman appeared from 3 doors down, walking fast across the wet grass. She was Beverly Osei, 46 years old, a tenured professor of constitutional law at Georgetown University Law Center, a published scholar on Fourth Amendment protections and federal overreach, and a woman who had known Nadine Ashford for 6 years as a neighbor and a friend. She stepped onto the driveway and spoke directly to Delano. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the precision of someone who had argued before appellate courts. "I know this woman. She is a sitting Article 3 federal judge appointed under the Constitution of the United States. You are violating 18 U.S.C. 111, which prohibits assault on a federal officer, and 18 U.S.C. 1501, which prohibits obstruction of judicial process. Uncuff her immediately." Delano turned toward her, jaw tight. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back. Leave now, or you will be placed under arrest for interference with a federal operation." Osei did not move. Not one step. She held her phone steady at chest level, the camera pointed directly at Delano's face. "I'm a constitutional law professor at Georgetown. I'm not leaving. And neither is my camera." Schofield shifted behind Ashford, glancing at the growing number of recordings, the witnesses, the retired colonel, still narrating into his phone. For the first time, something in her posture changed. Not guilt, not conscience, just the faint awareness that the ground beneath this operation had already given way. Delano stepped away from the driveway and walked toward the lead Suburban. He pulled his phone from his vest pocket and dialed. The neighbor footage captured what followed from a distance, but with perfect clarity. Delano pacing in a tight circle beside the vehicle, his free hand rubbing his forehead, then gripping the back of his neck, his voice rising, though the words were not fully audible. His gestures sharp and agitated. He was calling his field office supervisor. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When he returned to the driveway, his face had changed. The aggression was still there, buried just beneath the surface, but layered now with something else, something closer to damage control. He walked to Ashford, still pressed against the hood, and unlocked the cuffs without a word of explanation. He didn't apologize. Didn't acknowledge the badges, the credentials, the sealed court documents now scattered across the trunk of her car. He stepped back and said flatly, "There's been a mix-up." "You're free to go." Ashford straightened slowly. She rolled her shoulders, wincing as the left one moved. The bruise from the side mirror was already darkening beneath her jacket. She looked down at her wrists. The cuff marks were deep and red, pressed into her skin like brands. Her glasses lay cracked on the concrete. Her suitcase was open on the driveway, clothes spilling out. Her briefcase had been forced open, and sealed federal documents lay fanned across the trunk, exposed to the morning air and every camera still recording. She looked directly at Delano. Her voice was steady, controlled, and unmistakable. This was not a mix-up. This was a choice. Then she reached into her pocket, pulled out her own phone, and began recording. She panned slowly across the scene, the cuffs on the ground, the scattered documents, the 6 agents standing in a loose formation, none of them making eye contact, the 3 black SUVs still blocking her driveway, the neighbors on the street. She narrated as she filmed, her voice carrying the practiced clarity of a woman who understood the power of a record. "My name is Judge Nadine Ashford. I am a United States federal judge for the Eastern District of Virginia. Today is Saturday. It is approximately 6:30 a.m. I was detained in handcuffs in my own driveway by agents of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. No warrant was presented. No probable cause existed. I was not told what crime I was suspected of. My vehicle was searched. Sealed federal court documents were handled without authorization. I was arrested in my own driveway because I am black." Within 30 minutes of the SUVs pulling away from her street, the first calls began. They moved fast, and they moved in every direction. Colonel Eldon Pratt stood in his kitchen, still in his bathrobe, and dialed a friend he had served with decades earlier who now held a senior advisory position at the Pentagon. He described what he had watched from his front lawn. His voice was controlled but furious. "They cuffed a federal judge on the hood of her own car. I watched them do it. There was no warrant. There was no reason. She told them who she was and they didn't care." 3 doors down, Beverly Osei sat at her dining table and called the dean of Georgetown University Law Center. She gave a precise, unemotional summary of the legal violations she had witnessed and told the dean she intended to file formal statements with every relevant oversight body before the end of the day. 2 streets over, a neighbor named Franklin Yates forwarded his phone video to his daughter in Maryland, who worked as a junior editor at the Washington Post. She watched it once, then walked it directly to her supervising editor. Judge Ashford sat in her living room with an ice pack on her shoulder and called the chief judge of her circuit. She did not raise her voice. She did not break down. She spoke the way she had spoken on the bench for 11 years, with precision and weight. I was just arrested by ICE in my driveway. I was cuffed, searched, and humiliated. There was no warrant. The chief judge made one call to the administrative office of the U.S. courts. The administrative office contacted the Department of Justice Inspector General. The DOJ IG contacted the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General. DHS OIG contacted ICE's Office of Professional Responsibility. Each call was shorter than the last. Each one carried more urgency. By 8 a.m., less than 2 hours after Delano had first stepped out of his Suburban, the machinery of federal accountability was in full motion. Back at the ICE field office in Fairfax, Craig Delano sat at a desk in a windowless room and typed his incident report. His version of events bore no resemblance to what had actually happened on that driveway. He wrote that he had encountered an uncooperative individual who refused to identify herself and physically resisted agents during a lawful enforcement action. He wrote that the subject became combative and that the force used was necessary and proportional. He described the detention as routine. He made no mention of the judicial ID, no mention of the sealed court documents, no mention of the 7 witnesses, no mention of the cameras. He filed the report at 9:47 a.m. and flagged it as a standard field encounter with no further action required. Agent Tara Schofield read the report, added her electronic signature without a word of objection, and returned to her desk. Then Delano walked the document to Kyle Rennick. The youngest agent on the team sat in a chair near the back of the office, his jacket still on, his hands clasped between his knees. He had not spoken since they returned from the operation. Delano placed the report in front of him and pointed to the signature line. Rennick read it. His eyes moved across the words, then stopped. He looked up. That's not what happened. Delano leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough that the words stayed between them. Sign it, or your career is over. Rennick looked at the report. He looked at Delano, and he signed. But that night, alone in his apartment, Kyle Rennick sat on the edge of his bed and dialed the DHS Office of Inspector General anonymous hotline. His voice was quiet but steady. He identified himself by badge number. He said the incident report filed that morning by Supervisory Officer Craig Delano was fabricated. He said every material claim in it was false. He said the subject had been compliant, had identified herself clearly, had been a federal judge, and had been cuffed, searched, and humiliated without a warrant or probable cause. He said he would cooperate fully with any investigation, and then he asked for one thing: whistleblower protection. Because the man who had told him to sign that report was the same man who had put a federal judge in handcuffs that morning, and Rennick had seen exactly how far Delano was willing to go. Monday morning at 8 a.m., the DHS Inspector General formally opened an investigation into the detention of federal judge Nadine Ashford. By 8:30, the DOJ Civil Rights Division had assigned a team of attorneys to the case. By 9:15, the FBI was looped in, and the reason was simple. Federal judicial officers are protected under federal law. Assaulting or interfering with a sitting federal judge is a federal crime under 18 U.S.C. 111. Threatening or retaliating against a federal judge is a federal crime under 18 U.S.C. 115. This was not an internal affairs matter. This was not a policy review. This was a criminal investigation. FBI agents arrived at the ICE field office in Fairfax before lunch. They came with subpoenas and forensic technicians. They seized body cam footage from every agent on the team. They pulled GPS data from all 3 Suburbans. They copied radio communications from the morning of the incident. And they took Delano's operational planning documents, the targeting files, the address lists, the authorization memos, every piece of paper that was supposed to justify what happened on that driveway. What they found in those documents changed the shape of the entire investigation. There was no warrant for Nadine Ashford. There was no warrant for her address. There was no warrant for anyone at that address. There was no warrant for anyone on her street. The enforcement operation that morning had been targeting an individual in a neighboring zip code more than 2 miles away, in a different subdivision, on a street with a different name. Ashford's home was never part of any authorized federal action. Craig Delano had gone to the wrong street. And rather than verify, rather than pause, rather than check the address against his own operational file, he had looked at a black woman standing in a driveway and decided she was the target. FBI Digital Forensics spent the next 48 hours recovering and cataloging body cam footage from 3 agents on Delano's team, including Delano's own camera and Schofield's. The footage was time-stamped, geotagged, and continuous. It showed everything. It showed Ashford turning slowly with her hands visible. It showed her calm voice identifying herself as a federal judge. It showed Delano scoffing. It showed him grabbing her arm and spinning her into the side mirror of her own vehicle. It showed Schofield wrenching her other arm behind her back. It showed them pressing her face against the hood and cuffing her while she repeated, clearly and without hysteria, "I am a federal judge. You are making a serious mistake." It showed Ashford's body going still, fully compliant, not a single movement that could be characterized as resistance by any use of force expert in the country. It showed the agents tearing through her vehicle without consent, without a warrant, without documentation. It showed Delano holding her judicial ID badge in his hand, reading it, pausing, and then ordering his team to finish the sweep. It showed the sealed federal court documents being pulled from her briefcase and spread across the trunk, and it showed one moment that would become the most replayed clip in the entire investigation. Kyle Rennick leaning towards Schofield and whispering, "We need to stop," and Schofield, without turning her head, whispering back, "Shut up." Every frame of the footage directly contradicted every line of the incident report Delano had filed. Every claim of resistance was a lie. Every claim of combative behavior was fabricated. Every justification for force was invented. The neighbor videos, 4 separate angles recorded from phones across the street, corroborated the body cam footage frame by frame, word by word, second by second. A senior FBI analyst assigned to the case reviewed the combined footage, all 7 recordings synced to a single timeline, and wrote a single line in the official case file that would follow Craig Delano for the rest of his life. This is one of the most clear-cut cases of unlawful arrest, excessive force, and false reporting I have reviewed in 22 years of federal law enforcement. ICE leadership moved fast, but not fast enough. By Monday afternoon, Craig Delano and Tara Schofield were placed on immediate unpaid suspension. Their badges were confiscated. Their credentials were deactivated. Their access to federal systems was revoked. The field office director in Fairfax, a two-year veteran named Leonard Stokes, was quietly reassigned to an administrative role at a regional processing center, removed from command without public explanation. A joint statement was drafted between ICE and the Department of Homeland Security. It went through 4 revisions. Legal teams on both sides argued over language. They wanted to express concern without admitting liability, to acknowledge the incident without conceding wrongdoing. They planned to release it Wednesday morning with carefully controlled timing. But the internet did not wait for their schedule. Tuesday evening, one of the neighbor videos was uploaded to social media by the daughter of Franklin Yates, the neighbor who had recorded from across the street. It was 2 minutes and 47 seconds long. It showed the cuffing, the search, the scattered documents, and Judge Ashford's voice, clear as a courtroom ruling, saying, "I am a federal judge. You are making a serious mistake." Within 12 hours, it had been viewed 4 million times. The headline was everywhere, on every network, every news site, every front page. ICE agents cuff black federal judge in her own driveway. No warrant. By Wednesday morning, 3 members of the Senate Judiciary Committee had publicly demanded hearings. The full committee opened a formal inquiry by Thursday. The Congressional Black Caucus held a press conference on the steps of the Capitol, calling the incident a grotesque abuse of federal power rooted in racial profiling. The Chief Justice of the United States was briefed in a private meeting with the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. And then something happened that had not happened in over a decade. The federal judiciary, an institution that almost never speaks publicly on matters outside the courtroom, released a formal statement. It was 3 sentences long. It called the arrest of Judge Ashford an attack on the independence of the federal judiciary and a violation of the constitutional separation of powers. It said the judiciary expected full accountability from every agency and individual involved, and it said the courts would be watching. Those 3 sentences landed like a hammer inside every federal law enforcement agency in the country. 8 weeks later, a federal grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia returned its indictments. The charges against Craig Delano were devastating in their scope. Deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. 242, for detaining, cuffing, and searching a United States federal judge without a warrant, without probable cause, and without legal authority of any kind. Assault on a federal officer under 18 U.S.C. 111 for the physical force used against a sitting Article III judge, the grab, the spin into the side mirror, the compression against the hood, the cuffing, falsifying federal records under 18 U.S.C. 1001 for filing an incident report that was fabricated from the first word to the last, claiming resistance that never occurred, claiming combative behavior that every camera on the scene disproved, and conspiracy to obstruct justice under 18 U.S.C. 1512 for pressuring a subordinate agent to co-sign a false report and for attempting to construct a fraudulent official record designed to conceal the truth of what had happened on that driveway. Tara Schofield was charged with conspiracy, deprivation of rights under color of law, and falsifying federal records. The grand jury found that she had participated in the unlawful detention, had used physical force against a compliant subject, had co-signed a report she knew to be false, and had actively silenced a fellow agent who attempted to intervene. Kyle Rennick, the 28-year-old agent who had whispered "We need to stop" and who had called the OIG hotline that same night, was granted full immunity as a cooperating witness. He appeared before the grand jury and testified for nearly 3 hours. He described the operation, the stop, the cuffing, the search, the moment Delano held the judicial ID and chose to continue. He described the pressure to sign the false report. He described Delano's words exactly: "Sign it or your career is over." 2 additional agents from the team were named as unindicted co-conspirators for their participation in the warrantless search of Ashford's vehicle and their failure to intervene during the use of force. And the field office supervisor who had taken Delano's phone call from the driveway that morning, the call where Delano had paced and rubbed his forehead while a federal judge stood in cuffs behind him, was placed under a separate investigation for failure to act, because the question investigators wanted answered was simple: what did Delano tell him on that call? And why did it take a phone call to a supervisor for anyone on that team to uncuff a woman who had already identified herself, shown her credentials, and told them exactly who she was? The trial began on a Monday morning in the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, the same courthouse where Judge Nadine Ashford had presided over cases for more than a decade. She was not on the bench this time. She was seated in the gallery, watching the system she had spent her career serving attempt to hold accountable the men and women who had violated it. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution opened with the footage. They played the body cam recordings from Delano's camera, from Schofield's camera, and from a third agent whose chest-mounted unit had captured a wide angle of the entire driveway. They played all 4 neighbor videos, synced to a single timeline, projected onto a screen large enough for every juror to see every detail. The courtroom was silent. 12 jurors watched a federal judge in yoga pants get spun into a side mirror, pressed against the hood of her own car, and cuffed in her own driveway, while calmly identifying herself over and over again. They watched agents tear through her luggage. They watched sealed federal court documents get spread across a trunk. They watched Delano hold her judicial ID in his hand and order his team to keep going. Kyle Rennick took the stand on the fourth day. He described the operation from the inside. He described the moment he realized there was no warrant. He described the look on Ashford's face when the cuffs went on. He described whispering to Schofield that they needed to stop, and her response, "Shut up!" And he described sitting in the field office afterward, reading the incident report Delano had written, knowing every word of it was a lie, and hearing Delano lean in and say, "Sign it or your career is over." His voice broke once during testimony. He paused, took a breath, and continued. Beverly Osei testified as both a legal expert and an eyewitness. She walked the jury through the constitutional violations in clinical detail, then described what she had seen from her neighbor's lawn in language that was anything but clinical. She described a woman she had known for years, a woman who had dedicated her life to the law, being treated like a suspect in her own driveway by men who did not care what she said or who she was. Colonel Eldon Pratt, 68, retired Air Force, took the stand in a press suit and spoke in the clipped, precise cadence of a man who had spent 3 decades in military service. He described crossing his street in slippers and a bathrobe. He described shouting at federal agents. He described the moment Delano threatened to detain him for obstruction. And he described the look in Judge Ashford's eyes when her face was pressed against the hood of her car. "I have seen men and women in combat zones," he said. "I have never seen someone maintain that kind of composure under that kind of humiliation." Then Judge Ashford herself took the stand. The courtroom went still. She described the morning in detail. The coffee on the roof of her car, the garment bag, the sound of the SUVs, the moment Delano grabbed her arm, the impact of her shoulder against the side mirror, the cold metal of the hood, the tightness of the cuffs, the sound of her glasses hitting the concrete. She described the fear, the kind she had never experienced on the bench, the kind that lived in the body, not the mind. She described the humiliation of having her clothes pulled from her suitcase and spread across her own driveway. She described watching a man hold her judicial ID in his hand, read it, and decide it didn't matter. And then she said the words that would be quoted in every newspaper, every legal journal, and every civil rights filing for years to come. "I have spent my career upholding the Constitution. That morning, I learned how it feels when the Constitution fails to protect you." Delano's defense team argued good faith, wrong address, high-pressure environment, a rapidly evolving situation. They said their client had made an honest mistake under difficult operational conditions and that the force used was consistent with standard enforcement protocols. The prosecution dismantled the argument in a single afternoon. If this was a mistake, the lead prosecutor said, standing directly in front of the jury, then why did he write a report claiming she resisted? Why did he claim she was combative? Why did he pressure a junior agent to sign a document he knew was false? A mistake is going to the wrong address. A crime is what you do after you realize you went to the wrong address and decide to lie about it. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned on a Friday afternoon. Craig Delano, guilty on all counts, deprivation of rights, assault on a federal judge, falsifying federal records, conspiracy to obstruct justice, Tara Schofield, guilty on conspiracy and falsifying federal records. The courtroom was silent as the verdicts were read. Delano stared straight ahead. Schofield closed her eyes. In the gallery, Judge Ashford sat motionless, hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later in the same courtroom. Craig Delano stood before the bench in a Navy suit, no badge, no tactical vest, no sidearm. The man who had once told a federal judge, "I don't answer to you," now stood with his hands clasped in front of him, answering to a federal court. The sentencing judge, a veteran of the bench with more than 2 decades of experience, did not mince words. He looked directly at Delano as he spoke. "You did not merely make a mistake. You targeted, brutalized, and then lied about a sitting federal judge of the United States. You searched her vehicle without a warrant. You handled sealed court documents without authorization. You filed a federal report that was fabricated from beginning to end. And when a junior agent on your own team tried to tell the truth, you threatened to destroy his career unless he helped you bury it." You did not act in good faith. You acted with arrogance, with impunity, and with a belief that your badge placed you above the very laws you swore to enforce. The courts will not tolerate this. Craig Delano was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Tara Schofield stood next. She received 3 years. The judge noted that while her conduct was less aggressive than Delano's, her willingness to co-sign a false report, her active silencing of a fellow agent, and her failure to intervene during an unlawful arrest made her equally culpable in the conspiracy to cover up what had happened. Neither defendant spoke during sentencing. Neither apologized. Neither looked at Judge Ashford, who sat in the same seat she had occupied during the trial, watching the system deliver what the driveway had not. Within weeks of the verdict, Judge Ashford filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Craig Delano, Tara Schofield, the Fairfax Field Office, and the supervisory chain that had enabled the operation. The lawsuit cited unlawful arrest, excessive force, racial profiling, violations of the Fourth Amendment, and interference with a federal judicial officer. Discovery revealed internal communications, operational failures, and a pattern of complaints against Delano's unit that had been documented but never acted upon. The government's attorneys reviewed the evidence, the footage, the verdict, the public record, and recommended settlement. The case was resolved before trial for $4.6 million, one of the largest individual settlements in a federal civil rights case involving law enforcement. But the money was not the headline. The terms were. As part of the settlement, mandatory reforms were imposed on the Fairfax Field Office and adopted as a model across the agency. Independent civilian oversight of all enforcement operations involving residential addresses, revised protocols requiring warrant verification at every stage before agents made contact with any subject, anti-bias training administered quarterly with external review, a prohibition on conducting enforcement actions at any address not explicitly listed in the operational authorization, and a requirement that all incident reports be independently reviewed within 48 hours by personnel outside the reporting chain. The reforms did not undo what had happened on that driveway, but they made it harder for it to happen again. Craig Delano reported to a federal correctional facility in Cumberland, Maryland, with nothing but a single bag of approved personal items. His 6-year career was over. His federal pension was forfeited. His name now lived permanently in the Federal Bureau of Prisons inmate database. Tara Schofield was barred from federal employment for life. Her security clearance was revoked. She had spent 7 years building a career by never questioning the person above her. That silence cost her everything. Leonard Stokes, the field office director, retired under pressure without ceremony. 2 supervisors were formally demoted for failing to act on prior complaints against Delano's unit. Kyle Rennick was transferred to a new field office and 6 months later received a formal commendation from the DHS Inspector General for demonstrating integrity under extraordinary pressure. He never spoke publicly about the case. He didn't need to. Judge Nadine Ashford returned to the bench. She declined interviews and book deals, but at a judicial conference 6 months later, she stood at the podium and spoke without notes. The law failed me that morning. But the people did not. My neighbors came outside. A retired colonel crossed the street in his bathrobe. A law professor stood on my driveway and refused to move. A young agent with everything to lose made a phone call that changed the course of this case. She established the Ashford Justice Initiative, funding legal defense for victims of unlawful federal enforcement actions. A training module based on the incident was adopted by DHS, the DOJ, and the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. It included the full body cam footage, the false report, and Rennick's testimony. On the final slide was a photograph of her driveway, the handcuffs on the concrete, the scattered judicial documents, 3 unmarked Suburbans blocking the path of a woman who had done nothing but exist in her own home. Beneath it, in plain black letters, "This is what happens when power operates without accountability." Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And speaking of sleep, if you're someone who lies awake at 2 or 3 a.m., mind racing, unable to shut off. I know how frustrating that is. You're exhausted, but your brain just won't stop. And the worst part? The less you sleep, the worse it gets. Your energy crashes. Your mood suffers. Everything feels harder than it should. I struggled with this for years. Tried melatonin, white noise, warm milk, nothing worked long term. Then I found something called the 30-Day Uninterrupted Sleep Reset. It's a science-based program, no pills, no medication, that actually retrains your brain to sleep through the night, 7 to 8 hours, uninterrupted. Over 30 days, it rewires your sleep system. And once you're done, you keep the results. There's a maintenance plan so you don't slip back. Look, if you've tried everything and nothing sticks, this is different. Check the link in the description. Seriously, try it. And I'll catch you in the next story.
I already showed you my ID, officer.
You match the description of someone who broke into a vehicle on level 3. Step to the side.
This is my car. I can show you the
I
registration.
said turn around. Don't make this harder than it needs to
I'm a
be.
Navy SEAL. You don't want to do this.
I don't care if you're a damn war.
The parking garage was quiet at 9:47 p.m. on a Friday night. The kind of quiet that settles into concrete structures after the last office workers have gone home and the downtown streets have emptied out for the weekend. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting uneven pools of pale light across oil-stained concrete and painted lane markers that had faded years ago. 6 security cameras monitored the structure, mounted at strategic positions across every level, their red indicator lights blinking steadily in the dim light, recording everything in high-definition video with timestamps accurate to the second. On this Friday night, they would capture something that would be watched millions of times, analyzed frame by frame, and ultimately played on courtroom monitors in devastating clarity. Darnell Ashford, 36, walked across the second level toward his truck, his boots echoing off the concrete in a steady rhythm. He wore jeans, a gray Henley shirt, and a watch his team had given him after his 4th deployment. Nothing flashy, nothing suspicious. Just a man walking to his vehicle after dinner with his younger sister. But Darnell wasn't just any civilian. He was a Navy SEAL with 4 combat deployments across 3 theaters of war, 14 years of active service, and a Bronze Star with Valor Device for actions in Afghanistan that remained classified. He had led extraction missions under enemy fire. He had carried wounded teammates across hostile terrain in total darkness. At 36, he was transitioning to civilian life, trying to build something normal after more than a decade of extraordinary service. But in that parking garage, wearing civilian clothes and carrying nothing but his keys and his phone, none of that mattered. None of his sacrifice, none of his service, none of the nights he spent in combat zones protecting a country that was about to show him exactly how it treated men who looked like him. His truck was parked 40 feet ahead, a black Ford F-150 with a small American flag decal on the rear window. He was reaching for his keys when he heard it. Tires on concrete behind him, moving slowly, deliberately. Then headlights flooded the garage, washing the walls in harsh white light. A patrol car rolled toward him with the kind of slow, predatory approach that every black man in America recognizes instinctively. The engine idled low, the headlights didn't dim, and in that moment, Darnell Ashford felt a tension he hadn't felt since his last firefight in Kandahar province. The difference was that in Kandahar, he knew the rules of engagement. Here, the rules were whatever the man behind that badge decided they were. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. Officer Craig Lundgren had served with the Metropolitan Police Department for 16 years, building what his supervisors described as an impressive record of proactive law enforcement. His arrest numbers were consistently among the highest in his precinct. His evaluations praised his initiative, his willingness to engage in situations where other officers might hesitate. That was the official version, the version that earned him commendations and favorable assignments. But beneath that polished record lay something his supervisors chose not to see: 8 civilian complaints over 11 years. 4 of them filed by black men alleging racial profiling, excessive force, and unlawful detention. Each complaint reviewed by Internal Affairs and dismissed with language that had become routine. Insufficient evidence to sustain the allegation. Officer's account consistent with departmental policy. No independent witnesses to corroborate the complainant's version. Lundgren had learned the system. He understood that complaints without video evidence almost always died in the internal affairs process. He knew that his word as a 16-year veteran carried more weight than the word of the civilians he stopped, especially when those civilians were black men with no cameras rolling. Internal Affairs had flagged him twice. The first flag came after his 6th year when 3 complaints arrived within an 8-month period. The second came at year 12 when a lieutenant noticed that Lundgren's use of force reports disproportionately involved black males in low-traffic areas. Both investigations were opened quietly and closed even more quietly, buried under departmental bureaucracy and a union that fought every disciplinary action with ferocity. Fellow officers knew. They had seen Lundgren operate. They had heard him in the locker room making comments about certain neighborhoods and certain people that crossed lines most of them wouldn't cross out loud. But they looked the other way because his numbers made the precinct look good, because challenging a fellow officer meant becoming an outcast. Lundgren had a particular pattern. He preferred late-night stops, parking garages, parking lots, side streets with poor lighting, places where he assumed there would be fewer witnesses, fewer phones recording. He had perfected his routine over 16 years. Approach aggressively, establish dominance immediately, escalate at the first sign of anything he could interpret as resistance, then write a report that painted the picture of a dangerous suspect and a brave officer doing his duty. It had worked every single time. Until that Friday night when he pulled onto the second level and saw a large black man walking alone in the dim light. What Lundgren didn't know was that the man he was about to target had more combat experience than every officer in his precinct combined, and that 6 security cameras were recording every angle of what was about to become one of the most damning police encounters of the year. The cruiser door opened with a heavy metallic click that echoed through the concrete structure. Lundgren stepped out, leaving his headlights on, the high beams pinning Darnell's shadow against the far wall like a target. He pulled his flashlight from his belt and aimed it directly at the back of Darnell's head, the beam cutting through the dim garage like a searchlight. His other hand rested on his holster, fingers already curling around the grip of his service weapon. The security cameras on level 2 captured everything from 2 angles. One from the ceiling near the stairwell, showing the full distance between the 2 men. The other mounted above the elevator bank, capturing Lundgren's approach from the side. Both recordings showed the same thing. A police officer advancing on an unarmed man from behind with the aggression of someone responding to an armed robbery in progress rather than a man walking to his truck with his keys in his hand. "Stop right there. Don't move. Turn around slowly." Lundgren's voice bounced off the concrete walls, sharp, commanding, loud enough to echo through the entire level. The tone wasn't a request. It was a threat wrapped in authority, the voice of a man who expected immediate obedience and was already preparing for what he'd do if he didn't get it. Darnell stopped. His military training activated instantly, the way it always did under pressure, bypassing emotion and locking into protocol. De-escalate. Comply visibly. Keep your hands where they can be seen. Narrate your movements. Survive. He raised both hands slowly, palms open and facing outward at shoulder height, and turned around in a deliberate rotation that took nearly 4 full seconds. The cameras captured his face as the flashlight hit it. Calm. Controlled. The expression of a man who had stared down enemy combatants in pitch-black compounds and understood that panic got people killed. "Officer, I'm just walking to my truck." Darnell's voice was steady, respectful, measured. He nodded toward the F-150, parked 30 feet behind him, the American flag decal visible in the cruiser's headlights. "That's my vehicle right there." Lundgren didn't look at the truck, didn't acknowledge the explanation, didn't lower his flashlight or take his hand off his weapon. The cameras recorded his eyes fixed on Darnell, scanning him up and down with a look that had nothing to do with officer safety and everything to do with the conclusions he'd already drawn, the moment he saw a large black man alone on a dim parking level at night. In Lundgren's mind, the situation was already decided. The only thing left was finding a justification. "I've had reports of vehicle break-ins in this garage." Lundgren's voice carried the rehearsed confidence of a lie he'd used dozens of times before. "I need to see some identification." The cameras captured the demand clearly, the audio sharp in the quiet structure, every word recorded with the kind of clarity that would later make defense attorneys wince. Darnell kept his hands visible, his posture non-threatening, his breathing controlled. "Of course, officer, I'm going to reach into my back pocket for my wallet. I'm reaching slowly. Just my wallet." He narrated every movement the way black men in America learn to do, not because it's taught in any school, but because it's passed down through generations of survival. Through stories of traffic stops that turned fatal, through videos shared as warnings, through the unspoken understanding that your hands are either visible or they're a death sentence. His right hand moved toward his back pocket in exaggerated slow motion, fingers extended, palm open, every inch of movement deliberate and announced. The ceiling camera captured the full picture. A man moving with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb, doing everything in his power to appear non-threatening to a police officer who had already decided he was a threat. Lundgren interpreted that careful, deliberate movement as something else entirely, as mockery, as defiance, as a black man moving too slowly on purpose to disrespect his authority. His expression twisted, the cameras capturing the shift from manufactured professionalism to genuine anger. He closed the distance in 2 quick steps, swung his hand upward, and slapped the wallet out of Darnell's grip before he could even open it. The wallet skidded across the concrete floor, spinning under a parked sedan. Then Lundgren grabbed Darnell by the front of his shirt with both hands and drove him backward with the full force of his body weight. Darnell's back hit the concrete pillar first. Then his forehead cracked against the edge as Lundgren shoved him sideways, the impact splitting the skin above his right eyebrow in a gash that immediately began streaming blood down his face and into his eye. The sound echoed through the garage, a dull, sickening crack of skull against concrete that the ceiling camera's microphone picked up with nauseating clarity. Blood ran in a dark line down Darnell's cheek, dripping onto his gray Henley, pooling in the fabric at his collar. He didn't resist, didn't swing back, didn't grab Lundgren's wrists. A man trained to neutralize armed combatants in close quarters, a man who could have ended that confrontation in under 3 seconds with techniques classified by the Department of Defense, stood bleeding against a concrete pillar with his palms flat against the surface and said 5 words. "I'm not resisting, sir." The cameras recorded everything. The shove, the impact, the blood. The absolute stillness of a man who refused to give Lundgren the excuse he was looking for. And Lundgren's face, flushed and breathing hard, the expression of a man who was angry not because he was threatened but because his authority existed in the same space as a black man who wouldn't break. Keisha Ashford, 29, was a registered nurse at St. David's Medical Center, a woman who spent her days caring for patients in the trauma unit, monitoring vital signs, and staying calm in situations that would break most people. She had driven her brother to dinner that evening because his truck had been parked downtown since that morning, and it made sense to ride together. The plan was simple. She'd pull her car up to the 2nd level, pick him up at the elevator bank, and they'd both head home. A normal Friday night. The kind of ordinary evening that shouldn't make the news. She turned onto the 2nd level ramp at 9:52 p.m. and saw the flashing lights immediately. Blue and red strobing against concrete walls, bouncing off windshields of parked cars, filling the level with the kind of urgent light that her nursing instincts associated with emergencies. She pulled forward slowly, her headlights sweeping across the scene, and what she saw through her windshield stopped her heart. Her brother, bleeding from a gash above his right eye. Face pressed against a concrete pillar, a police officer behind him with a knee driven into the center of his back, one hand gripping the back of Darnell's neck, pressing his face harder into the rough surface. Keisha threw the car into park and was out the door before the engine fully stopped. Her scream echoed through the structure, raw and guttural, the sound of a woman watching someone she loved being brutalized. "What are you doing to him? That's my brother. What did he do?" Lundgren whipped around, his face flushed, his expression shifting from aggression to irritation at being interrupted. Get back in your car, now. You interfere with this, and I'll arrest you too. His voice was a snarl, the cameras capturing every word, the threat aimed at a 9-year-old woman whose only crime was witnessing what he was doing. Keisha didn't get back in her car. Her hands were shaking. Tears streamed down her face, but she pulled out her phone, opened the camera, and started recording. Her nursing training had taught her to function through panic, to keep working when everything inside her was screaming. She pointed the lens directly at Lundgren and began narrating in a voice that trembled but never stopped. That's my brother on the ground. His name is Darnell Ashford. He's a Navy SEAL. He served this country for 14 years. He has a Bronze Star. He was walking to his truck. He's bleeding from his head. This officer is kneeling on his back. Why are you doing this? Why is he bleeding? Put that phone away right now, Lundgren barked, pointing at her, his face contorted with the rage of a man who understood on some level that he was being documented. Shut that off or you're going to jail. She didn't shut it off. She stood her ground, 15 feet from her brother, recording everything the overhead cameras might not capture in detail. The close-up of blood running down Darnell's face, the way Lundgren's knee pressed into his spine, the snarling expression of an officer who wasn't protecting anyone but was punishing a man for existing in the wrong place with the wrong skin color. Her footage would later sync with the security cameras to create a complete record, multiple angles, ground level, and overhead of every second of what Craig Lundgren did that night. Lundgren forced Darnell off the pillar and drove him face down onto the garage floor. Darnell's chest hit the concrete with a heavy impact, his cheek pressing into oil-stained pavement, the gash on his forehead smearing blood across the surface in a dark streak the cameras captured in sharp detail. He didn't resist, didn't tense, didn't pull away. He lay flat with his arms at his sides, palms up, offering zero resistance to a man who needed none to continue. Lundgren grabbed Darnell's right wrist and wrenched it behind his back with a violent upward twist that the ceiling camera recorded clearly. The angle of the arm bent far beyond what any use of force policy would justify on a compliant subject. Then the left wrist yanked back with equal aggression. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the concrete structure, the sound sharp and final, bouncing off the walls and ceiling like a gunshot. Keisha's phone captured the audio clearly. The ratcheting of the cuffs tightening, then tightening further, Lundgren cranking them down until the metal bit into skin. Then he planted his knee in the center of Darnell's spine and pressed his full weight downward. Darnell's chest compressed against the concrete. His breathing changed immediately, shallow and labored, each inhale a struggle against 210 pounds of pressure concentrated on his back. The ceiling camera captured his face turned sideways on the pavement, blood still running from the gash, his mouth open, trying to pull air into lungs that couldn't fully expand. I can't breathe properly. The words came out strained, barely above a whisper, but Keisha's phone was close enough to capture them with devastating clarity. Words that carried a weight the whole nation understood. Words that had become a symbol of everything broken in the relationship between law enforcement and the people they claimed to serve. Lundgren's response was captured on every recording device in that garage. You can talk. You can breathe. Stop being dramatic. The mocking tone was unmistakable. The contempt in his voice wasn't even disguised. He began searching Darnell aggressively, hands rifling through his pockets with the carelessness of a man emptying trash. He pulled items out and tossed them onto the oil-stained concrete one by one. Car keys skidding across the pavement. A phone, screen cracking as it hit the floor. Then something smaller, heavier. A military challenge coin from SEAL Team 4, the bronze medallion that service members carry as a symbol of unit identity, brotherhood, and sacrifice. It hit the concrete with a distinct metallic ring and rolled in a slow arc before settling flat, the SEAL trident catching the fluorescent light. Lundgren didn't look at it, didn't register what it meant. Then a Veterans Affairs medical ID card. Lundgren glanced at it for less than a second, the cameras capturing his eyes flicking down and then away, and tossed it aside onto the oil-stained floor like it was a gas station receipt. The ceiling camera recorded the moment in a wide shot that would later be freeze-framed thousands of times online, a decorated combat veteran face down in his own blood on a parking garage floor. His challenge coin on the concrete beside him, his VA card discarded in a puddle of motor oil, and a police officer kneeling on his spine, breathing hard, not because he was threatened, but because brutalizing a man who wouldn't fight back was apparently exhausting work. Miriam and Jorge Delgado had spent the evening at a concert downtown. A rare date night for the couple, both in their early 40s, both teachers at Jefferson Middle School who didn't get out as often as they used to. They had parked on the third level of the garage that morning and were walking back to their car at 9:56 p.m., talking about the show, their voices echoing softly in the empty level above the commotion they hadn't yet noticed. Then Miriam heard the scream. A woman's voice, raw with terror, rising up through the open gap between levels the way sound travels through concrete structures, amplified and distorted but unmistakably desperate. She grabbed Jorge's arm and they both moved to the railing that overlooked the second level. What they saw stopped them both mid-step. A black man face down on the garage floor, handcuffed, blood visible even from one level up, a dark smear on the concrete near his head. A woman standing 15 feet away, phone raised, crying, her voice shaking as she narrated what was happening. And a police officer standing over the handcuffed man with a posture of total authority, chest heaving, his body language radiating aggression toward two people who posed no threat to anyone. Jorge pulled out his phone immediately and started recording. His elevated angle captured something Keisha's ground-level footage couldn't. The full spatial picture of the second level, Darnell's truck parked 30 feet away in a direct line from where he'd been stopped. The cruiser behind him with its headlights still blazing, the empty lane between them showing the obvious path of a man walking in a straight line toward his own vehicle. No other cars disturbed, no broken windows, no tools or equipment that would suggest a break-in. Nothing. Just a man who had been walking to his truck and was now bleeding on the floor in handcuffs. Miriam was already dialing 911, her hands trembling as she pressed the phone to her ear. When the dispatcher answered, she spoke quickly but clearly, her teacher's voice cutting through the panic. "I'm in the downtown parking garage on 5th Street. There's a police officer assaulting a man on the second level. The man is handcuffed and bleeding. He's not resisting. The officer is being extremely aggressive. We need help here." The dispatcher paused. "Ma'am, we show an officer already on scene at that location. Is there a separate incident?" Miriam's response was captured on the 911 recording that would later be played in court. "No, you don't understand. The officer is the problem. He's the one hurting this man. We're watching it from the level above. My husband is recording. This man is bleeding from his head and he's in handcuffs and he's not moving. Please send someone else. Please." The 911 call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Every word recorded. Every description matching exactly what the security cameras and Keisha's phone had already captured. Jorge's footage, steady and elevated, providing the wide-angle context that would later prove devastating in court, showing the complete absence of any threat, any suspicious activity, any justification for what Craig Lundgren had done to a man who was simply walking to his truck. Backup arrived at 10:04 p.m., 2 patrol cars pulling onto the second level, their headlights joining Lundgren's cruiser in flooding the garage with light. The first officer out was a young patrolman who surveyed the scene with wide eyes and immediately deferred to Lundgren's authority. The second was Officer Nadine Prescott, a 1-2-year veteran with a reputation in the department for doing things by the book even when the book was inconvenient. Her body camera activated the moment she stepped out of her vehicle, and what it recorded in the first 30 seconds became some of the most important footage in the entire case. Prescott's camera captured her walking toward the scene with measured steps, her eyes moving across the garage the way a trained officer should, taking in every detail. Reading the situation before speaking, what she saw was a black man face down on the concrete in handcuffs, blood pooling beneath his forehead, motionless, compliant, his breathing shallow and labored. A young woman 15 feet away holding a phone with tears streaming down her face, still recording. and Lundgren standing over the handcuffed man, breathing hard, sweat on his forehead, his knuckles scraped raw on his right hand. The knuckles told a story all by themselves. Prescott approached Lundgren and asked the question her body camera recorded with perfect clarity. "What happened here, Craig?" Lundgren's response was immediate, rehearsed, delivered with the confidence of a man who had talked his way through incident reports for 16 years. Subject was acting suspiciously near vehicles on this level, possible connection to the break-ins we've been getting. I approached and he became combative, had to use force to gain compliance. Prescott's camera captured her looking from Lundgren back to Darnell, motionless on the ground, hands cuffed behind his back, palms open, blood running from a gash that clearly came from impact with the concrete pillar 4 feet away, the smear of blood on its surface visible in the headlights. Then back to Lundgren, scraped knuckles, heavy breathing, the posture of a man who had exerted significant force against someone who showed zero signs of having fought back. Her expression said everything her mouth didn't. The camera captured it clearly. She didn't believe a single word. She keyed her radio immediately. "Dispatch, I need medical to the downtown garage, 2nd level. I have a subject in custody with a head laceration and possible respiratory distress. Requesting paramedic response." Paramedics arrived 8 minutes later. They treated Darnell on the garage floor while he remained in handcuffs because Lundgren refused to remove them despite Prescott's request. The laceration above his right eyebrow required 7 stitches. His right shoulder was partially dislocated from the cuffing, the joint swollen, and already bruising. He had 2 bruised ribs on his left side from the sustained pressure of Lundgren's knee on his spine. All of it documented by paramedics on their medical report, captured on Prescott's body camera as she stood watching with an expression of barely concealed disgust, and photographed by Keisha, who had not stopped recording for a single second since she stepped out of her car. Her phone battery was at 11%. Her hands hadn't stopped shaking, but she kept that camera pointed at her brother and the man who had brutalized him because she understood something fundamental. The footage was the only thing standing between the truth and whatever story Craig Lundgren was going to tell. Keisha Ashford called the parking garage management company at 11:23 p.m. that same night, less than 90 minutes after paramedics had stitched her brother's forehead on the concrete floor. Her voice was hoarse from crying, but steady with the determination of a woman who understood that evidence disappeared when it was inconvenient for the people responsible. She identified herself, described what had happened, and made one request: preserve the footage. All of it. Every camera. Every angle. The call was routed to the head of security, a man named Victor Sutton, 52 years old, a former Marine who had served 2 tours in Iraq before transitioning to private sector security management. Sutton pulled up the footage on his monitors within the hour. He started with camera 4, the ceiling mount above the elevator bank that had the widest angle of the 2nd level. He watched Craig Lundgren's cruiser roll onto the level, watched the headlights flood the garage, watched Darnell Ashford stop, raise his hands, turn around slowly with his palms open, watched the flashlight aimed at his face, watched the conversation, watched the wallet get slapped away, watched Lundgren grab a compliant man by his shirt and drive him into a concrete pillar head first, watched the blood, watched a Navy SEAL with a bronze star get forced face down onto the floor and knelt on while he said he couldn't breathe. Sutton watched all 6 angles. Then he watched them again, synchronized on a split screen with matching timestamps. Then he stood up from his desk, walked to the bathroom, and was physically sick. He had seen combat. He had witnessed violence in theaters of war that most civilians couldn't imagine. But watching an American serviceman brutalized by a police officer in a parking garage while doing nothing but walking to his truck hit something in him that combat never had. He didn't wait for a supervisor's approval. He personally burned copies of all 6 camera angles to 4 separate hard drives, sealed 2 in the company's safe, handed 1 to the company's legal team with a written chain of custody memo, and locked the 4th in his own office. Then he called Keisha back and told her the footage was preserved and protected. Nobody was erasing anything, not on his watch. The footage was devastating. Synchronized timestamps across all 6 angles showed every second from Lundgren's arrival at 9:47 p.m. to Prescott's intervention at 10:04 p.m. 17 minutes of continuous high-definition recording from multiple perspectives that left zero room for interpretation, no suspicious behavior from Darnell at any point, no vehicle break-in activity, no combative movements, no aggressive gestures, no resistance of any kind, just a man walking to his truck in a straight line, then being stopped, slammed into a pillar, thrown to the ground, handcuffed with excessive force, and knelt on while bleeding from his head. But the security cameras weren't even the most damning evidence. Lundgren's own body camera told its own story, recording from his chest as he approached, escalated, and brutalized a compliant man. And then investigators discovered something worse: his dash cam, the in-car camera that recorded audio and video inside the cruiser from the moment it was activated. Before Lundgren opened his door, before he stepped onto the second level, the dash cam captured him sitting behind the wheel, looking through his windshield at Darnell's silhouette walking in the dim light, and muttering 6 words to himself. Another one of these guys creeping around. The racial implication wasn't subtle. It wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't open to interpretation. It was a man revealing exactly what motivated him before he even made contact. Keisha uploaded her phone footage to social media at 1:14 a.m. that night. By morning, it had 500,000 views. By the end of the week, 2.3 million. The comments were a flood of outrage, shared experiences, and demands for accountability that the department could not ignore. Solomon Adeyemi saw the footage on a Saturday morning, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before he finished watching. He was a civil rights attorney with 18 years of experience, a Harvard Law graduate who had built his practice on police misconduct cases, winning judgments and settlements that had forced policy changes in 6 different departments across 3 states. He had seen hundreds of use-of-force videos over the course of his career, footage that ranged from questionable to clearly excessive. But what he watched on his phone that morning, a Navy SEAL being brutalized in a parking garage for the crime of walking to his own truck, was among the most egregious he had ever witnessed. He contacted Keisha through a message on social media that afternoon. By Sunday evening, he had met with Darnell and Keisha at their family home, reviewed Keisha's original unedited footage, and agreed to take the case pro bono. No retainer, no hourly fees. This case wasn't about money for Adeyemi. It was about precedent. It was about accountability. It was about making sure that what those cameras recorded led to consequences that actually meant something. He filed simultaneously on Monday morning a federal civil rights complaint with the U.S. Attorney's Office and a criminal referral directly to the FBI's Civil Rights Division. The complaint cited 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal statute that carried a maximum sentence of 10 years when the violation involved bodily injury. The filing included Keisha's footage, the 911 recording from Miriam Delgado, and a formal request to preserve and obtain all parking garage security footage and all police department recordings, including body camera and dash cam video. The FBI opened their investigation within 72 hours. Federal agents pulled Lundgren's complete service record, every incident report, every use of force filing, every civilian complaint, every internal affairs review from 16 years on the force. What they found was a horror show documented in the department's own paperwork: 23 stops of black men in parking structures and parking lots over the previous 3 years alone. Not a single one resulting in actual criminal charges. Every report following the same pattern: suspicious behavior near vehicles. Subject became combative when approached. Force used to gain compliance. 23 times the same story. 23 black men stopped, detained, searched, and released without charges because there were never any crimes to charge them with. The 8 prior civilian complaints took on new weight under federal scrutiny. Each one described the same escalation pattern. Each one had been dismissed by Internal Affairs with identical boilerplate language. Each one represented a moment where the department had the opportunity to stop Lundgren and chose not to. Fellow officers began coming forward anonymously, speaking to federal investigators under assurances of confidentiality, describing Lundgren's behavior as an open secret in the precinct. Everyone knew. Everyone had seen it or heard about it. Nobody had reported it through official channels because the culture of the department made clear that officers who broke ranks faced consequences far more severe than officers who broke the law. The police union deployed its standard defense. Lundgren was a decorated officer acting within the scope of his duties. The stop was justified based on reported vehicle break-ins. The use of force was proportional to the perceived threat, but the footage was too damning for the usual playbook. The dashcam audio alone, another one of these guys creeping around, destroyed any argument that the stop was motivated by anything other than race. The chief of police, facing national media coverage that showed no signs of diminishing and public pressure that intensified with every news cycle, suspended Craig Lundgren without pay 9 days after the incident. It was the first meaningful discipline of his 6-year career, and it was only the beginning. The federal indictment came down 4 months after the incident. 2 counts of deprivation of rights under color of law under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, 1 count of assault under color of authority. Craig Lundgren was arrested at his home by FBI agents who put him in the same handcuffs he had used on dozens of men whose only crime was being black in his presence. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution opened with the footage. All 6 parking garage camera angles played simultaneously on a massive split-screen display, synchronized to the second. The jury watched Darnell walk across the second level toward his truck, reach for his keys, and then watched Lundgren destroy his evening, his body, and his dignity in 11 minutes of uninterrupted high-definition footage. The wallet slapped away, the skull driven into concrete, the blood, the knee on the spine. I can't breathe properly. Stop being dramatic. The challenge coin rolling across oil-stained concrete. Every moment captured from 6 angles and 1 phone held by a woman whose hands never stopped shaking. Darnell testified for 4 hours. His service, 4 deployments, the brothers he lost overseas, the funerals where he folded flags, and then that Friday night, the headlights, the flashlight. The moment his forehead hit the pillar and everything went white. I have been in firefights where I genuinely believed I was going to die, he told the jury. And the most afraid I have ever been in my life was lying on that garage floor with a police officer's knee on my back. Because in combat, I knew the rules. In that garage, there were no rules. There was just him. Keisha testified through tears. The Delgados described what they witnessed from the level above. Officer Prescott took the stand and told the courtroom what her body camera had already shown on her face. I knew he was lying. I've been on this job for 12 years, and I knew within 30 seconds that what Officer Lundgren described did not happen. The defense argued protocol. Lawful stop. Non-compliance justified escalation. Standard playbook. Then the prosecution played the dashcam audio. Lundgren's face behind the windshield, looking at Darnell's silhouette. Another one of these guys creeping around. The courtroom went silent. Not polite quiet. Absolute silence. 12 jurors understanding in 6 words exactly what motivated everything that followed. The jury deliberated for 1 day and 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Lundgren was sentenced to 5 years and 4 months in federal prison. The judge was direct. You swore an oath to protect the public, and you used that oath as a weapon against the very people you were supposed to serve. He was remanded into custody immediately. He did not look at Darnell as he was led from the courtroom. The civil lawsuit settled for $4.7 million, plus sweeping departmental reforms that went further than any the department had agreed to in its history. Mandatory de-escalation training with annual recertification, independent civilian review of all stops in parking structures and low-visibility environments, a civilian oversight board with full subpoena power, quarterly public reporting on use-of-force demographics broken down by race, location, and outcome, complete overhaul of the internal affairs process with mandatory external review of racial profiling complaints, zero tolerance for failing to activate body cameras, court-enforceable mandates with a federal monitor appointed for 5 years. A $600,000 compensation fund was established for Lundgren's previous victims. The 23 black men he had stopped in parking structures over 3 years, detained, searched, humiliated, and released without charges, were contacted through a dedicated outreach program to receive restitution and counseling. Darnell used a portion of his settlement to establish the Ashford Veterans Justice Initiative, providing free legal representation to veterans who face police misconduct after serving their country. Black and brown veterans experienced disproportionately higher rates of hostile police encounters despite their service. The initiative partnered with veteran organizations and civil rights firms across 11 states in its first year, taking on 34 cases. Keisha's footage became required viewing in police academies nationwide, a case study in what unlawful force looks like, what a compliant subject looks like, and what happens when officers allow bias to override their oath. Victor Sutton, the former Marine who preserved the garage footage, mounted a small bronze plaque on the pillar where Darnell bled. 5 words: "Rights don't end where concrete begins." Lundgren served his sentence, maintaining he'd done nothing wrong, never apologized, never acknowledged what 6 cameras and a dash cam recorded. His name became synonymous with the brutality that thrives where officers assume no one is watching. But someone was always watching. 6 cameras, a sister with a phone, a couple on the level above, a former Marine who refused to let the truth be erased, and a Navy SEAL who survived combat across 3 theaters of war only to face the fight of his life in an American parking garage 40 feet from his own truck with an American flag decal on the rear window. If you believe veterans who serve this country deserve to come home to a nation that respects their rights, that officers who assault civilians based on race deserve federal prison, and that cameras can be the difference between justice and another buried complaint, subscribe and turn on notifications. Tomorrow, we have another story that proves the truth doesn't stay hidden when ordinary people refuse to look away. This case was disturbing, but the one on the right ends in a way no one expects.
You know what I think, Bryce? I think she stole that suit too. Probably walked right out of Nordstrom with it.
Wouldn't surprise me.
Check the tags. Bet they're still on.
Look at her, stone quiet. That's the guilty look right there.
At 5:47 a.m., inside Reagan National Airport, the terminal was nearly empty. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow across the polished floors. A few early travelers shuffled toward security, coffee cups in hand, eyes still heavy with sleep. The checkpoint machines beeped in a steady rhythm. Nothing about the morning suggested anything unusual was about to happen. A black woman in her early 50s walked through the terminal with the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of commanding courtrooms. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, perfectly pressed. Her carry-on rolled behind her in a smooth, practiced motion. Her posture was straight, her pace unhurried. She had done this walk 1,000 times. This was Judge Vivian Hartwell, a federal appeals court judge on the 4th Circuit Court of Appeals, appointed by the President of the United States 3 years earlier after a unanimous Senate confirmation. She had spent 18 years as a federal prosecutor before that, trying cases that put cartel leaders and corrupt politicians behind bars. She was traveling to Chicago for the National Judicial Conference, where she was scheduled to deliver the keynote address on civil rights and judicial integrity. Her credentials were impeccable. Her reputation was spotless. She had dedicated her life to the law, to the belief that justice applied equally to everyone, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. But in the next 12 minutes, none of that would matter to the 2 officers who were already watching her from across the terminal. What they didn't realize was that their body cameras were recording every word, every action. Everything that was about to happen would be captured in high-definition video that would eventually reach the White House. Officer Bryce Kessler stood near the security checkpoint with his arms crossed, scanning the terminal the way a predator watches a watering hole. He was 44 years old, stocky, with a shaved head and a permanent scowl etched into his face. 16 years with the Reagan National Airport Police Department had taught him one thing: he could do whatever he wanted as long as he used the right words in his reports. His record should have ended his career years ago. 31 complaints over 14 years, racial profiling, excessive force, intimidation, harassment. Every single complaint had been reviewed by internal affairs and dismissed. Witnesses recanted. Victims stopped returning calls. Supervisors wrote phrases like unsubstantiated and insufficient evidence and filed the paperwork away where it would never see daylight. Kessler had learned the system. He knew that as long as he claimed someone was evasive or matched a description or exhibited suspicious behavior, no one would question him. His colleagues called him old school. Some of the younger officers admired him. Others quietly requested transfers after working a few shifts by his side. His partner that morning was Officer Danny Stokes, 29 years old, 5 years on the job. Stokes was tall and lean, with the eager energy of someone still trying to prove himself. He laughed at Kessler's jokes, nodded at his opinions, and never once questioned his calls. When Kessler moved, Stokes followed. When Kessler spoke, Stokes agreed. Kessler's eyes locked onto a figure moving through the terminal, a black woman in an expensive suit, walking like she owned the place. Something about her bothered him. The confidence, the posture, the way she didn't look down when she passed. He nudged Stokes with his elbow. "Watch this one." Judge Hartwell had already cleared security and was walking toward Gate 23 when she heard the voice behind her. "Ma'am, stop right there." She stopped. She turned slowly, her carry-on coming to rest beside her. 2 airport police officers were approaching, one older with a shaved head, the other younger and trailing slightly behind. The older one had his hand resting on his duty belt, fingers inches from his weapon. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was calm, measured, the same tone she used when attorneys in her courtroom tried to grandstand. Kessler stepped closer than necessary. His eyes moved over her suit, her jewelry, her confident posture. Something about her irritated him in a way he couldn't articulate. A black woman moving through his terminal like she had every right to be there, dressed like she was somebody important, looking him in the eye like they were equals. "You fit a description," he said. "We had a theft reported earlier this morning, someone matching your appearance." Hartwell's expression didn't change. "I'm a federal judge with the 4th Circuit Court of Appeals. I'm traveling to Chicago on official judicial business. I've been through security and I'm heading to my gate." Kessler's lips curled into a smirk, the kind of smirk that said he had heard every excuse, every lie, every desperate attempt to talk out of trouble. "Sure you are." Stokes shifted his weight behind his partner, positioning himself to block her path forward. A businessman nearby slowed his pace, watching. A young woman at a coffee kiosk looked up from her phone. Kessler's body camera blinked red on his chest, recording everything. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he just didn't care. "I'm going to need to see some identification." Kessler's voice carried the flat authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. Judge Hartwell took a slow breath. She had handled hostile witnesses, violent defendants, attorneys who screamed objections across her courtroom. She knew how to stay calm when others wanted her to break. "I'm going to reach into my bag for my credentials," she said clearly. "I'm moving slowly so there's no misunderstanding." She unzipped the front pocket of her carry-on and retrieved a leather folder. Inside was her federal judicial identification card issued by the Administrative Office of the United States Courts, her state bar card from when she practiced law, her official travel itinerary showing the conference in Chicago and her role as keynote speaker. She handed them to Kessler. He looked at the judicial ID for less than 3 seconds. He flipped the bar card over like it was a grocery store receipt. He didn't bother reading the itinerary. "These could be fake," he said, tossing the folder back toward her. It hit her chest and fell to the floor. "Anyone can print stuff like this. Doesn't prove anything." Stokes nodded. "We see fake IDs all the time." Hartwell bent down slowly and picked up her credentials. Her hands were steady, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Officer, I am a sitting federal appeals court judge appointed by the President of the United States. You can verify my identity with one phone call to the U.S. Marshal Service or the 4th Circuit Clerk's office." Kessler stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "I'll verify what I want to verify," he said. "Now turn around." Kessler didn't step back. He stepped forward. He was close enough now that Judge Hartwell could see the veins in his neck, the flush of anger creeping up from his collar. His breath came in short, controlled bursts. The mask of professional detachment was slipping, revealing something uglier underneath. "People like you," he said, his voice low but sharp enough to carry, "think a fancy suit means you're above the law. Think you can walk through here like you own the place, like the rules don't apply to you." Hartwell met his eyes without flinching. "I'd like your badge number, officer, and the name of your supervisor." Kessler didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge the request. His hand moved to his cuffs. Stokes shifted to the right, closing off any path she might have taken to walk away. His hand hovered near his belt. His eyes darted between Hartwell and the growing number of travelers who had stopped to watch. A white businessman in a navy blazer stood frozen near the window, his rolling bag forgotten beside him. A young woman in her 20s had her phone raised, camera pointed directly at the confrontation. A mother pulled her child closer and backed away slowly. Kessler noticed the phone. "Put that away," he barked at the young woman. "This is official police business. You're interfering with an investigation." The woman hesitated but didn't lower her phone. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept recording. Kessler turned back to Hartwell. His jaw was tight. His patience was gone. Whatever restraint he had maintained was evaporating in real time, captured frame by frame on body cameras and civilian phones that would soon be seen by millions. "Last chance," he said. "Turn around. Now." Judge Hartwell spoke slowly and clearly, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I am not resisting. I am complying with your instructions. But I am also telling you, officer, that you are making a serious mistake. I am a federal judge. This will not end the way you think it will." Something in Kessler's expression shifted. His eyes narrowed, his nostrils flared. It was the look of a man who had never been challenged by someone he considered beneath him and who refused to tolerate it now. He grabbed her right arm and wrenched it behind her back. The motion was violent, sudden, and completely unnecessary. Before she could react, his other hand slammed into her upper back, driving her forward and down. Judge Vivian Hartwell hit the terminal floor face first. The sound was sickening, a dull crack followed by a sharp gasp from the crowd. Her glasses flew from her face and skidded across the tile, one lens shattering into pieces. Her carry-on tipped over. Her briefcase burst open, scattering legal documents and a garment bag containing her judicial robe across the polished floor. Stokes dropped immediately, driving his knee into the center of her back. "Stop resisting," he shouted. "Stop resisting," Kessler echoed, pinning her wrists together behind her. She was not resisting. She was 52 years old. She weighed 140 pounds. She lay completely still, her cheek pressed against the cold tile, blood beginning to trickle from a gash above her eyebrow where her face had struck the ground. 6 civilian phones recorded every second. 2 body cameras captured every angle. The red lights blinked silently, preserving what would become the most damning footage of police brutality the country had seen in years. For a moment, the terminal was silent. Then the reactions came all at once. The white businessman in the navy blazer stepped forward, his face twisted with disbelief. "That's a federal judge," he shouted, pointing at the scattered credentials on the floor. "What the hell are you doing? She showed you her ID." A black woman standing near the coffee kiosk had her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. She shook her head slowly, unable to speak, watching a nightmare unfold in real time. An elderly man in a worn Navy veteran's cap pushed through the small crowd that had gathered. His voice was hoarse but steady. "You're assaulting her. She didn't do anything. I watched the whole thing. She was cooperating." Kessler's head snapped toward him. "Sir, back off. Now. This is a police matter. Everyone needs to clear the area." No one moved. Stokes pulled Hartwell's wrists together and snapped the handcuffs into place. The metal clicked with a cold finality. She lay motionless on the tile, blood pooling slowly beneath the gash above her eyebrow. Her charcoal suit was torn at the shoulder. Her judicial robe spilled out of its garment bag like evidence at a crime scene. She said nothing. Not a word of protest. Not a cry of pain. Not a single plea for help. Years of training had taught her this moment. As a prosecutor, She had prepared witnesses for hostile cross-examinations. As a judge, she had watched defendants destroy their own cases by talking too much. She knew that everything happening right now was being recorded. The body cameras, the phones, the witnesses who would later testify. Her silence was her weapon, and it would prove more devastating than anything she could have said. Lieutenant Cheryl Davenport heard the commotion on her radio before she saw it. Dispatch had called it a disturbance near Gate 23, but the voices crackling through the channel told a different story. Shouting, angry witnesses, something about excessive force. She moved quickly through the terminal, her hand resting on her radio, her instincts telling her this was about to become a very long day. She arrived in under 4 minutes. The scene stopped her cold. A black woman lay on the ground in handcuffs, her face bloodied, her suit torn, surrounded by scattered documents and a garment bag. A crowd of angry travelers stood in a semicircle, phones raised, voices overlapping with accusations and demands. Kessler stood over the woman with his arms crossed, his jaw set in defiance. Stokes hovered nearby, looking nervous for the first time. "What happened here?" Davenport demanded. Kessler answered without hesitation. "Suspicious individual. She was evasive during questioning, became verbally aggressive, and refused to comply with lawful commands. She resisted when I attempted to detain her." Davenport looked at the woman on the ground, then at the crowd, then at the documents scattered across the tile. A leather folder lay open near her foot. She bent down and picked it up. Inside was a federal judicial identification card. The photo matched the bloodied face on the floor. The name read, Vivian Hartwell. The title read, United States Circuit Judge, 4th Circuit Court of Appeals. Davenport's face went pale. The color drained from her cheeks so completely that Stokes took a step back. "Bryce," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you know who this is?" Kessler blinked. For the first time, something flickered behind his eyes. Not guilt, not remorse, but the faintest shadow of doubt. It was already far too late. Lieutenant Davenport stepped away from the scene, her hand trembling as she raised her radio. She switched to a private channel and called Captain William Driscoll, the commanding officer on duty. "Captain, we have a situation at Gate 23. A federal judge has been detained and injured by 2 of our officers. I need you here now." Driscoll arrived in 3 minutes. One look at the scene and he was on his phone. His first call went to the airport authority director. The director listened for less than 30 seconds before interrupting. "A federal judge? Are you absolutely certain?" He was calling the Department of Justice liaison before Driscoll finished answering. The DOJ liaison, a career attorney who had handled sensitive cases for 15 years, made one call of his own. It went directly to the White House counsel's office. 12 minutes. That was all it took. 12 minutes from the moment Judge Vivian Hartwell's face hit the terminal floor to the moment the White House learned that a sitting federal appeals court judge, appointed by the president himself, had been slammed to the ground and handcuffed by airport police while traveling on official business. The president was briefed within the hour. By mid-morning, the DOJ Civil Rights Division had been activated. FBI agents were dispatched to Reagan National to secure all evidence. Federal marshals arrived to ensure Judge Hartwell received immediate medical attention and protection. The airport police department was ordered to preserve all body camera footage, radio transmissions, and incident reports. Kessler and Stokes were separated and placed in different rooms. Their badges were confiscated, their weapons were taken. This was no longer a local matter. This was no longer an internal affairs review. This was a federal case, and it was moving faster than anyone at Reagan National had ever seen. The FBI evidence team pulled the body camera footage within 2 hours of the incident. Kessler's camera had recorded everything from the moment he first spotted Judge Hartwell walking through the terminal. Stokes's camera captured the secondary angles, the positioning, the moments his partner's camera missed. Together, they provided a complete, uninterrupted record of the entire encounter. Federal prosecutors gathered in a secure conference room at the DOJ building to review the footage. No one spoke as it played. They watched Hartwell stop when commanded. They watched her calmly identify herself as a federal judge. They watched her slowly retrieve her credentials, announce every movement, and hand over documents that clearly established who she was. They watched Kessler glance at her federal judicial ID for less than 3 seconds before throwing it back at her chest. They heard him say, "People like you think a fancy suit means you're above the law." They watched him step closer, watched her request his badge number, watched him ignore her completely. And then they heard him say, just before he grabbed her arm, "I don't care if you're the Queen of England. You don't talk to me like that." The slam was brutal. The sound of her face hitting the tile made one of the junior attorneys look away. The image of Stokes driving his knee into her back while shouting, "Stop resisting," at a motionless 5-2, old woman drew a sharp exhale from across the room. There was no ambiguity. There was no alternative interpretation. There was no other side to consider. When the footage ended, the room was silent for a long moment. A senior prosecutor, a man who had spent 2 decades handling civil rights cases, finally spoke. "That," he said quietly, "is the clearest case of civil rights violation I've seen in 20 years." The FBI and DOJ didn't just investigate the incident, they investigated the man. Within 48 hours, a team of federal agents had pulled every complaint ever filed against Officer Bryce Kessler. 31 complaints over 14 years. Each one had been reviewed by Internal Affairs. Each one had been dismissed, filed away, forgotten. But now, under federal scrutiny, the patterns that had been ignored for over a decade became impossible to deny. 14 of Kessler's prior victims agreed to be re-interviewed. Every single one was Black or Latino. Their stories were nearly identical, stopped for no reason, accused of fitting a description. Demands for identification, followed by dismissive responses when credentials were provided. Threats of arrest, physical intimidation. In 4 cases, handcuffs. In 2 cases, injuries that required medical attention. None of them had been charged with any crime. None of them had done anything wrong. Investigators subpoenaed internal emails from the airport police department. What they found was damning. Supervisors had known about Kessler's behavior for years. Complaints had been flagged, discussed in meetings, and deliberately minimized. One email from a former captain, dated 3 years earlier, was particularly devastating. It read, "Kessler's aggressive, but he gets results. The complaints are from the usual suspects. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." The usual suspects. The phrase echoed through the federal investigation like a confession. The cover-up wasn't one rogue officer protecting himself. It was institutional. Supervisors had enabled Kessler. Internal Affairs had cleared him. The system had protected him at every turn, allowing him to target minorities for 14 years without consequence. Until now. The president's statement was released at 4 p.m. Eastern, less than 10 hours after the assault. It was brief, direct, and left no room for interpretation. The assault on Judge Vivian Hartwell is an affront to the rule of law and to the principles this nation was founded upon. A sitting federal judge was attacked by those sworn to protect the public. This administration will ensure full accountability for everyone involved. 2. Within the hour, the Attorney General held a press conference on the steps of the Department of Justice. Her words were measured but firm. The DOJ has opened a federal civil rights investigation into the Reagan National Airport Police Department. We will examine not only the actions of the officers involved in this incident, but the institutional failures that allowed a pattern of discriminatory enforcement to persist for over a decade. The Secretary of Homeland Security, whose department coordinated with airport police agencies nationwide, issued a directive demanding an immediate review of use-of-force policies and complaint handling procedures at every airport police department in the country. What happened at Reagan National cannot be treated as an isolated incident, the statement read. We must examine whether similar failures exist elsewhere. At the daily White House press briefing, reporters fired questions about the administration's response. The press secretary stood at the podium, her expression grave. "Let me be clear," she said. "An attack on a federal judge is an attack on the judiciary itself. It is an attack on the constitutional separation of powers. It is an attack on the foundation of our democracy. There will be accountability, there will be consequences, and this administration will not rest until justice is served. Behind closed doors, the message was even more direct. Careers would end, prosecutions would follow, no one would be protected. The consequences came faster than anyone at Reagan National had ever seen. Officer Bryce Kessler was arrested 3 days after the incident. Federal agents took him into custody at his home at 6 a.m., placing him in handcuffs in his own driveway while neighbors watched from their windows. He was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, assault of a federal official, and filing a false police report. His law enforcement certification was revoked before the end of the week. At his arraignment, prosecutors argued that Kessler was a flight risk and a danger to the community. They cited his history of violence, his pattern of targeting minorities, and the severity of the charges. The judge agreed. Bail was denied. Bryce Kessler, who had spent 16 years believing he was untouchable, was led out of the courtroom in shackles. Officer Danny Stokes was arrested the same morning. He was charged with conspiracy to deprive civil rights and failure to intervene during the commission of a federal crime. His 5 years of following Kessler's lead without question had finally caught up with him. But the destruction didn't stop with the officers. 3 supervisors were fired within 2 weeks, including Captain Raymond Vogel, the man whose email had dismissed complaints against Kessler as coming from the usual suspects. The airport police chief, facing mounting pressure from federal investigators and the media, submitted his resignation. The Airport Authority Board, which had overseen the department for years without addressing systemic failures, was dissolved by order of the city council and reconstituted with entirely new members. The Department of Justice imposed a federal consent decree on the Reagan National Airport Police Department. Independent monitors would oversee all operations. New use-of-force policies were mandated. Body camera compliance would be reviewed weekly. Complaint handling procedures were completely restructured. 16 years of institutional protection had collapsed in less than a month. The federal trial of Bryce Kessler began on a cold Monday morning in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every available seat. The gallery included civil rights attorneys, law enforcement officials, and members of Congress who had traveled to witness the proceedings. On the first day, prosecutors played the body camera footage. The courtroom was silent as Kessler's own camera showed him approaching Judge Hartwell. They watched him dismiss her credentials. They heard him say, "People like you, and I don't care if you're the Queen of England." They watched him grab her arm and drive her face into the tile. They heard Stokes shout, "Stop resisting," at a motionless woman. Several jurors looked away. One wiped her eyes. Over the next 2 weeks, 14 prior victims took the stand. One by one, they described encounters that mirrored what had happened to Judge Hartwell. The stops without cause, the fabricated justifications, the threats, the humiliation, a pattern stretching back over a decade, exposed in devastating detail. Judge Vivian Hartwell testified on the 8th day. She wore a dark suit and simple glasses to replace the ones that had shattered on the terminal floor. Her voice was calm, precise, and unwavering. She recounted every moment of the assault, every word Kessler had spoken, every second she had spent lying on the cold tile with a knee in her back and blood running down her face. Kessler's defense was simple. He had followed protocol and felt threatened by Hartwell's demeanor. The video evidence destroyed that argument before it could gain traction. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Bryce Kessler was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Danny Stokes, who had cooperated with investigators, received 3 years. The supervisors who had enabled Kessler's behavior for over a decade faced their own trials in the months that followed. 6 weeks after her face hit the terminal floor at Reagan National Airport, Judge Vivian Hartwell returned to the bench. The gash above her eyebrow had healed into a thin scar that she made no effort to hide. She walked into her courtroom in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals with the same quiet authority she had carried through that terminal on the morning everything changed. Her clerk stood as she entered. The attorneys present fell silent. For a moment, no one moved. Then she took her seat and called the first case. The judicial conference in Chicago had been postponed, but not canceled. 3 weeks after her return to the bench, Judge Hartwell delivered her keynote address via video link from her chambers. She spoke for 22 minutes without notes. She spoke about accountability, about the justice system's obligation to protect everyone equally, regardless of who they are or what they look like, about the courage of the witnesses who had raised their phones and refused to look away, about the body cameras that had captured the truth when lies might have prevailed. Justice is not a guarantee, she said. It is a responsibility. It requires vigilance. It requires courage. And it requires all of us citizens, officers, judges, to hold ourselves and each other accountable. She did not seek the spotlight. She gave no interviews. She declined book deals and speaking offers that would have made her wealthy. But her case became a landmark nonetheless. Body camera footage, civilian recordings, and institutional accountability had combined to deliver something rare: actual consequences. The civil settlement was reached 4 months after the incident. The Reagan National Airport Authority agreed to pay $4.2 million to Judge Hartwell, along with a formal public apology and a commitment to implement every reform demanded by the federal consent decree. In Congress, a bipartisan group of legislators introduced the Hartwell Reform Act, mandating federal oversight of airport police departments, standardized use of force policies, and independent review of all complaints alleging racial profiling or discrimination. The bill passed the House within 6 months. In her chambers, Judge Hartwell kept one item from the incident: her shattered glasses, the frames bent and one lens missing, were mounted in a simple black frame on her desk.